The city was asleep in the way only cities pretend to be. Streetlights hummed softly, traffic signals blinked to empty intersections, and the night carried a false sense of mercy. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, when witnesses were scarce and courage was thinner than air, the first body was discovered. It lay in a small park, wedged between concrete buildings, a place meant for children during the day and silence at night. The victim's name would come later. For now, there was only the position of the body, carefully arranged, almost respectful, and the dark stains soaking into the grass beneath it. This was not a crime of panic. It was a performance. Detective Elias Rowe arrived just before sunrise. He stood apart from the uniformed officers, hands in his coat pockets, eyes tracing the scene without speaking. He had seen violence before, enough to know when something felt wrong. This felt deliberate. The stillness around the body pressed against him, heavy and intentional, as if the killer expected an audience. Near the victim's outstretched hand, etched crudely into a flat stone, was a symbol, simple lines intersecting in a circular shape. Not a word, not a threat, just a mark. Rowe crouched to examine it, a cold tightening in his chest. Symbols were not meant to explain. They were meant to be remembered. "Any witnesses?" he asked quietly. A young officer shook his head. "Nothing yet. No cameras pointing this way either. It's like whoever did this chose the dark on purpose." Rowe nodded, though his attention never left the symbol. Killers who wanted to disappear avoided signatures. They fled, erased, denied. This one had done the opposite. He had stayed long enough to carve his presence into stone. As the sun crept higher, the park began to look ordinary again. Joggers gathered at the taped perimeter, whispering. Phones came out. Fear spread faster than facts ever could. Rowe straightened, feeling the familiar weight settle behind his eyes. He already knew this case would follow him home. Later, alone in his office, he studied the crime scene photos again. The angle of the body, the precision, the symbol. It didn't speak of rage, it spoke of control. Someone wanted to be acknowledged, not caught, seen, not stopped. Rowe leaned back as staring at the ceiling as an old instinct stirred awake. This was not the end of something, it was the beginning. A signal flare fired into the dark, daring anyone to look up. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that its quiet had already been broken. Somewhere within its streets, the person who carved that symbol was waiting, watching, and smiling at the thought that the game had finally begun. Rowe wrote one word in his notebook before closing it: Zodiac. He didn't know why the name came to him, only that the symbol felt less like a signature and more like a constellation, points connected by intent rather than chance. Whatever followed would not be random deaths. It would be a pattern, drawn slowly, patiently across the city itself. As he turned off the office light, a chilling certainty followed him into the hallway. This killer was not finished speaking. This killer had only just learned how to be heard. The silence ahead promised answers, but demanded a terrible price.
Dawn had barely settled when the call came in. Another body. Different location, same unsettling calm wrapped around the scene. Detective Elias Rowe listened in silence, the word Zodiac still echoing in his mind from the night before. Coincidence was a luxury he no longer trusted. This time, the victim lay beneath an overpass, the concrete above streaked with rust and old rain. The city roared nearby, yet the space itself felt sealed off, private. Rowe noted the posture immediately. Not identical to the first, but similar enough to itch at his instincts. Careful placement. No sign of struggle. Violence delivered with purpose, then stopped. Uniforms talked in low voices as Rowe walked the perimeter. Another symbol had been left behind, scratched into a support pillar. Same circular form, same intersecting lines. The killer wasn't improvising. He was repeating himself. "You're seeing patterns because you want to," a lieutenant muttered nearby. "Two scenes don't make a theory." Rowe didn't argue. Patterns never announced themselves loudly. They waited for someone patient enough to listen. Back at headquarters, the case was already becoming noise. Media chatter, political pressure, demands for reassurance no one could honestly give. Rowe spread the photos across a conference table, studying them in sequence. Distance between locations, time of day, body orientation. Details others dismissed as trivial began aligning in his head. He felt the weight of expectation pressing down, heavy as the files piling beside him. A woman entered quietly, almost apologetically, carrying a slim folder. She didn't wear a badge like the others. Her presence felt observational rather than authoritative. "I'm Mara Quinn," she said, behavioral analysis. "I was asked to take a look." Roe gestured to the table. "Then tell me I'm wrong." She didn't answer immediately. She leaned over the images, her eyes moving slowly, deliberately. "You're not wrong," she said at last. "But you're also not looking at a killer chasing victims. You're looking at someone chasing reactions." That got his attention. "These symbols," Mara continued, tapping one photo, "they're anchors. He wants consistency because consistency builds recognition. Recognition builds fear. Fear builds power." Roe felt a chill settle into his shoulders. "So what happens next?" She met his gaze. Escalation or communication, sometimes both. The room felt smaller after that. The idea of a single murder was terrifying enough. The idea of a mind planning a sequence was worse. Roe realized then that the killer wasn't hiding in the city. He was weaving himself into it. Each choice, each location, was another thread pulled tight. Every silence was intentional. Every delay a test of patience and resolve meant only for him. As night fell again, Roe returned to the first park alone. The stone had been removed, the grass disturbed, but the memory lingered. He imagined the killer standing there, carving slowly, unafraid of time or discovery. Someone who believed the pattern mattered more than the act. Someone who needed witnesses more than victims. Roe's phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from an unknown number. No words, just an image. A rough sketch of the same symbol, darker now, heavier. Beneath it, a single line appeared. "You're starting to see it." Roe stared at the screen, pulse steady but cold. Mara had been right. This wasn't about bodies, it was about attention. And the killer had just made his next move. Somewhere nearby, unseen and patient, the pattern was already expanding, waiting for its next point to be drawn. The city slept unaware, while the mind behind the symbols prepared to speak again. Louder, bolder, and far more personal. Very soon. By the third night, the city was no longer pretending. News vans lined the streets outside police headquarters, their lights washing the building in nervous color. Elias Rowe watched from his office window as reporters rehearsed concern, already hungry for a story that felt alive. He knew why they were there. So did the killer. The first letter arrived just after noon, delivered by a clerk whose hand shook despite training. It was addressed simply, carefully, as if written by someone who understood procedure. Inside the envelope lay thick paper, the surface indented by deliberate pressure. Symbols filled the page, familiar and twisted, arranged like a puzzle meant to frustrate rather than solve. There was no signature, yet it felt signed all the same. Roe read it alone, not because of protocol but instinct. The letter did not threaten, it spoke. Short sentences, measured pauses, questions disguised as observations. The words circled around him, suggesting awareness of the investigation's private doubts. It was intimate in a way that felt invasive, as though someone had been standing just behind his thoughts. Mara joined him minutes later, silent until he handed her the page. She scanned it slowly, her expression tightening. "This isn't about confession," she said. "It's about relationship. He's inserting himself into your routine." Another letter followed before sunset, then another. Different handwriting, same tone. The killer was adapting, testing reactions in real time. Each note carried a riddle. Each riddle hinted at details not yet released. The department locked down information, but it no longer mattered. The mind behind the symbols was already ahead. Word leaked by evening. Someone always talked. Social media ignited with speculation, screenshots, fear packaged as entertainment. The symbols appeared everywhere, copied badly on walls, notebooks, digital screens. Panic sped not because of what people knew, but because of what they imagined. Roe sat through briefings that felt pointless, strategies discussed, resources shifted. None of it addressed the truth clawing at him. Writing letters was slower than killing. It meant restraint, control, a need to be understood. The killer didn't want chaos yet. He wanted acknowledgement. Late that night, Roe found another envelope on his desk. No career, no record, just waiting. Inside was a shorter note. Fewer symbols, more words. One sentence stood out, underlined with deliberate force. "You think patterns protect you." Roe felt the weight of it settle into his chest. This wasn't broadcast. It was personal. The killer wasn't talking to the city anymore. He was talking to him. Outside, sirens echoed as patrols doubled. Inside homes, people locked doors earlier than usual, listening to every unfamiliar sound. The fear had crossed a boundary. It was no longer confined to crime scenes or conference rooms. It lived in kitchens, bedrooms, and sleepless minds. Mara stood in the doorway, watching Roe fold the letter carefully.
He's building trust, she said quietly, and when that breaks, it will hurt more than the violence. Ro looked down at the symbols one last time. Somewhere within their angles and circles was a promise, not of escape, of continuation. The killer had found his voice, and now he was learning how to whisper. Soon he will raise it, and when he did, the message would no longer be hidden in ink and paper, but written directly into the lives he had already chosen. He closed the file and turned off the lamp, knowing sleep would not come. Somewhere, the writer of those letters was measuring his reaction, adjusting tone and timing like a performer refining an act. Tomorrow, the city would wake louder, angrier, demanding certainty. Tonight, uncertainty ruled. The pattern was no longer forming quietly. It was accelerating, pulling others into its gravity, and the next move would not arrive by envelope alone. It would announce itself through action, not ink, and force every watcher to become a participant in the unfolding nightmare ahead.
Violence was only the surface. Elias Rowe understood that now, sitting alone in the interview room long after the lights dimmed. The letters, the symbols, the timing between acts, all of it pointed to something deeper. Control was the true currency. Control over fear, control over attention, control over him. The department replayed recordings from recent tip lines. Most were noise, but one voice lingered. A woman, hesitant, breaking. She spoke of a man she once knew, someone obsessed with systems, calendars, cycles, someone who believed life made sense only when arranged into patterns. Her name was redacted, but her fear was not. Rowe listened again, slower this time. The woman mentioned small things, how the man corrected her language, how he chose where they sat, how silence became punishment. There was no accusation, only memory. It felt older than the crimes, rooted somewhere private and unresolved. Mara Quinn stood behind the glass, arms folded. People think control looks like force, she said. It rarely does. It looks like guidance, like certainty, like someone who convinces you they know what's best. Rowe glanced at the empty chair across from him, imagining the killer there, calm, composed, waiting to be understood. The symbols were masks. The murders were punctuation. What mattered was the response, the slow tightening of attention around a single mind pulling invisible strings. A second fragment surfaced later that day, buried in an old case file, a former coworker's statement, years old, dismissed as irrelevant at the time. It described a quiet man, helpful, meticulous, deeply offended by disorder. He kept journals filled with diagrams and dates. After his dismissal, the workplace reported vandalism, circles, lines, crossed marks. Rowe felt something shift. The city suddenly felt smaller. That evening, he walked the streets instead of driving. He watched faces, hands, the way people occupied space. Anyone could crave control. Anyone could hide obsession behind routine. That thought unsettled him more than the killings themselves. At home, Rowe opened a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were photographs from an earlier case, one that had ended badly. A suspect released, evidence lost. A man who had stared at Rowe across a table and smiled without warmth. The symbol hadn't been there then, but the feeling had, the sense of being measured. The realization settled slowly, like a weight. What if the killer wasn't emerging now, but returning? What if this wasn't escalation, but continuation delayed by patience? His phone buzzed. No image this time, just text. You walk too much. You think better that way. Rowe froze. That detail had never been shared. Across the city, someone was watching not just the investigation, but the investigator, close enough to observe habits, close enough to remember old failures. Control, he realized, wasn't about distance, it was about proximity. As Rowe stared at the message, a new fear replaced the old one. The killer didn't want to be chased, he wanted to be invited. And with every question Rowe asked, every step he retraced, he was unknowingly moving closer to the center of the pattern, where the mask would eventually come off, and something far more personal would be revealed next. He sensed the shift before anyone named it. The case was no longer external, no longer safely contained in files and evidence bags. It had turned inward, pressing against memory, habit, routine. Tomorrow would bring new testimony, more fragments, another voice stepping cautiously into the light, someone who knew the man behind the symbols not as a myth but as a presence. And when that voice finally spoke, the illusion of distance would collapse entirely, forcing Rowe to confront how long the killer had been shaping this path, waiting patiently for recognition, for permission, for the moment when control would no longer hide by symbols, but demand obedience from everyone watching closely.
The name surfaced quietly, almost apologetically, buried inside a sealed personnel record that should have stayed forgotten. Elias Rowe found it while cross-referencing old statements with recent tips, the kind of procedural digging that rarely produced anything but dust. This time, it produced a memory. Her name was Lena Mercer. Years ago, long before the symbols and letters, she had been connected to a minor internal investigation. Not a suspect, not a witness in any formal sense, just a presence that hovered at the edges of a case Rowe had once worked and failed to close. At the time, her involvement had seemed personal, inconvenient, and ultimately irrelevant. Now it felt deliberate. Rowe sat with the file open, reading between the lines. Lena had been involved with a man whose name appeared repeatedly in marginal notes, crossed out but never erased. Their relationship was never acknowledged publicly. It existed in quiet spaces, late nights, borrowed time, careful lies. The record spoke in neutral language, but the pattern underneath was unmistakable. Secrecy, dependency, control disguised as devotion. Mara Quinn joined him, drawn by the silence. "Forbidden relationships create their own gravity," she said after reviewing the file. "They pull harder because they're hidden. Shame becomes a bond." Rowe imagined it now, a connection sustained by fear of exposure, by the thrill of being unseen. Love shaped by imbalance, where one voice guided and the other learned to orbit. In those conditions, affection could easily rot into fixation. He requested an interview. Lena arrived hesitant, older than the photograph, but carrying the same guarded posture. She didn't ask why she'd been called. She already knew. Some truths never fully leave. They just wait. "He liked rules," she said softly when the question circled close enough. "Not laws. Patterns. He said chaos was weakness, that people needed structure, even if they didn't know it." Rowe listened without interrupting. This wasn't testimony. It was confession without accusation. "He chose when we spoke, where we went, what mattered," she continued. "I thought it was love. It felt like certainty, like being chosen." Her hands trembled slightly. "When I tried to leave, he said I was breaking the pattern." The room felt heavier with every word. The Zodiac persona, the symbols, the precision, began to shed its myth. What remained was a man terrified of abandonment, convinced control was the only way to prevent loss. Trauma, unaddressed, had found a language. After Lena left, Rose sat seated, staring at the empty chair. Forbidden love didn't fade cleanly. It lingered, warped by memory and resentment. If the killer had lost that connection, the wound would have deepened, not healed. Obsession was grief that refused to accept an ending. That night, another letter arrived, shorter than the others, fewer symbols. One sentence stood alone in careful ink. Some orbits were never meant to break. Rowe felt the confirmation settle like ice. This wasn't mythology. It was biography. The killer wasn't recreating violence. He was reenacting loss, rewriting a past where control failed him. Every symbol was an attempt to restore balance. Every death, a correction. As Rowe filed the letter, he understood the danger shifting shape. This wasn't just about being seen anymore. It was about reclaiming something stolen. Love, power, identity. And if Lena represented the beginning of that fracture, then the next phase would bring those wounds fully into the light. The pattern was tightening, drawing old relationships into its center. Soon another voice would emerge, closer still, carrying a truth neither silence nor distance could protect. And when that happened, the Zodiac would stop circling the past and begin collapsing inward, toward confrontation. The room fractured before the case ever did. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped, files slammed shut with unnecessary force. Pressure had turned colleagues into rivals, and certainty into something everyone pretended to possess. Elias Rowe stood at the center, listening as theories collided without mercy or restraint. "It's obsession, not planning," one detective snapped. "No, it's methodical," another shot back. "You don't ritualize like this by accident." Rowe watched the arguments unfold, recognizing fear dressed up as confidence. Each person wanted distance from failure, from responsibility. The constellation they were meant to map together had splintered into isolated points. Mara Quinn broke the noise. "You're all reacting to outcomes," she said sharply. "He's reacting to you. That's the difference." Silence followed, thick and resentful. Rowe cleared his throat.
The letters aren't updates, he said. They're mirrors. He's watching how we respond, how the city breathes, where attention fractures. A lieutenant scoffed. So what, he's psychic now? No, Mara replied. He's attentive. Trust eroded further after that. Briefings ended with unresolved tension. Information stalled between departments. Someone leaked a partial profile to the press, and the city twisted it into spectacle. Fear became louder than facts, and the killer adapted instantly. That night, Roe received another letter. This one wasn't symbolic. It was written plainly, almost kindly. It referenced the meeting room, the arguments. A line underlined twice read, "You argue like you're afraid of being wrong." Roe felt heat rise behind his eyes. The killer wasn't observing crime scenes anymore. He was studying emotion. He confronted Mara in the hallway. How close is he? Close enough to feel the shifts, she answered. Close enough to enjoy them. Their voices dropped instinctively, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. The next letter arrived addressed to Roe by name. No envelope. Just waiting on his desk. It referenced Lena without mentioning her, describing a star pulled from orbit. The intimacy was unmistakable. This wasn't provocation. It was possession. Roe slammed his fist against the desk, frustration finally breaking through discipline. He knows too much, he said. Someone is feeding him. Or, Mara said carefully, he already belonged here once. That thought cracked something open. Old access, old habits, old trust misplaced years ago. The past wasn't just influencing the present, it was embedded within it. The team met again, but this time the distance was visible. People chose seats carefully. Conversations softened, guarded. The killer had succeeded in his quiet goal. He didn't need to divide them openly. He only needed them uncertain of one another. Another message came just before midnight. Short, surgical. I can tell who you trust by who you don't look at. Roe stared at the words, feeling exposed. This wasn't escalation through violence. It was escalation through intimacy. The Zodiac was no longer performing for the city. He was shaping the investigation itself, bending reactions, forcing fractures, learning which cracks would split wide enough to break everything apart. Roe understood then what came next. When pressure reached its limit, something would give. Not evidence, not theory. A person. Someone would falter, confess, or collapse under the weight of being watched. And when that happened, the constellation would shatter completely, clearing the way for the killer to reveal not just his pattern, but his true face, waiting patiently behind the fractures he had so carefully created.
Sleep stopped coming naturally after the fractures widened. Elias Rowe drifted instead, caught between memory and vigilance, waking to thoughts that felt planted rather than formed. The killer had learned the rhythm of his mind, and now that rhythm echoed back at him in unfamiliar ways. He began noticing gaps, moments he couldn't account for, a mug left untouched, a file reread without memory of opening it. Trauma had a way of resurfacing, not as clarity, but as erosion. The investigation wasn't just testing his resolve, it was dismantling his defenses piece by piece. Mara Quinn saw it before he admitted it. You're internalizing him, she said during a rare quiet moment. That's how this kind of mind works. It infects. Roe wanted to deny it, but the truth lived beneath the words. The Zodiac wasn't just leaving symbols in public spaces anymore. He was carving them into memory, reopening wounds that never healed properly. Control thrived where pain lingered. Across the city, the killer unraveled in his own way. Letters grew uneven, symbols overlapped, lines pressed too hard into the page. The precision faltered. Control demanded constant maintenance, and cracks were forming beneath the mask. Obsession fed on itself until it bled through restraint. Fragments surfaced from his past through scattered testimonies, a childhood marked by rigid discipline, affection conditional, approval earned through perfection. When order failed, punishment followed. Love had always come with rules, and breaking them meant abandonment. The Zodiac persona was not born in violence, but shaped by correction. Roe listened as Mara pieced it together aloud. He learned early that chaos meant pain, she said, so he learned to eliminate chaos, in others, in himself. But he didn't, Roe replied. He just hid it. That was the fracture, the line where victimhood twisted into harm. Trauma explained behavior, but it didn't absolve it. The killer bled inward, then outward, convincing himself the pain he caused was necessary, even righteous. Patterns replaced empathy. control replaced connection. Rowe wasn't immune to the same distortion. Old cases resurfaced in his thoughts uninvited. The suspect he'd let go years ago, the apology he never accepted, the belief that justice was something you could complete and move past. That illusion was gone. Justice, he realized, lingered. It demanded revisiting. Another letter arrived, unlike the others. No riddles, no taunts, just a paragraph written in uneven strokes. It spoke of being unseen as a child, of silence that punished more than words, of learning that pain responded to structure. It ended with a question written smaller than the rest. If you had learned this sooner, would you be different? Rowe felt the weight of it settle into his chest. The line between hunter and hunted blurred dangerously. He could see the logic, understand the path. That understanding terrified him more than the crimes themselves. Mara watched him closely. Understanding isn't agreement, she said, sensing the shift, but it is proximity. Be careful how close you stand. The city outside reflected the same fracture. People argued online over motives, empathy, blame. Some excused, some condemned. The killer had succeeded in one more way. He had turned suffering into debate, trauma into spectacle. Rowe realized then that the Zodiac didn't want absolution or capture. He wanted recognition of his pain, to be seen as constructed, not monstrous. But acknowledging that truth came at a cost. The closer Rowe moved toward understanding, the more the killer seemed to lean in as well, bleeding into the investigation, into thought, into identity. The mind that bled was not just the killer's, it was everyone pulled into his gravity. And as that shared fracture deepened, Rowe sensed the next phase approaching, the point where understanding would no longer be theoretical. Someone, somewhere, would break under the weight of this shared trauma, and when that happened, the question would no longer be who the Zodiac was, but who would be left standing once the pain finally chose a direction.
The truth surfaced the way poison does, slowly, invisibly, until damage was already done. Elias Rowe sensed it before anyone said a word. The investigation had begun to feel staged, not by the killer alone, but from within. Pieces that should have aligned never quite did. Gaps lingered where answers should have lived. The break came from an audit request no one remembered filing, an old access log, a name that appeared too often, then stopped appearing altogether. Someone had filtered information early on, redirecting tips, delaying reports, softening details before they reached the core team. It wasn't sabotage in the dramatic sense. It was quieter, more careful, and far more dangerous. Rowe confronted the truth in a small office under harsh fluorescent light. The person across from him didn't deny it. They looked tired, ashamed, afraid. "I didn't think it mattered," the voice said, at first. Mara Quinn stood beside Rowe, silent but rigid. "You don't get to decide what matters," she said finally. "Not in a case like this." The withheld truth unraveled quickly once exposed. A prior connection, a personal history that overlapped with the killer's past. Someone had recognized the patterns early and chosen silence over scrutiny, not out of loyalty, but fear. Fear of consequences, fear of being wrong, fear of being seen. Rowe felt the betrayal settle heavily. This wasn't just a procedural failure, it was emotional. Trust had been weaponized, not by the Zodiac directly, but by his influence. He had created an environment where withholding felt safer than honesty. Control extended even here. Did he ask you to? The truth surfaced the way poison does, slowly, invisibly, until damage was already done. Elias Rowe sensed it before anyone said a word. The investigation had begun to feel staged, not by the killer alone, but from within. Pieces that should have aligned never quite did. Gaps lingered where answers should have lived. The break came from an audit request no one remembered filing, an old access log, a name that appeared too often, then stopped appearing altogether. Someone had filtered information early on, redirecting tips, delaying reports, softening details before they reached the core team. It wasn't sabotage in the dramatic sense. It was quieter, more careful, and far more dangerous. Rowe confronted the truth in a small office under harsh fluorescent light. The person across from him didn't deny it. They looked tired, ashamed, afraid. "I didn't think it mattered," the voice said, at first. Mara Quinn stood beside Rowe, silent but rigid.
"You don't get to decide what matters," she said finally. "Not in a case like this." The withheld truth unraveled quickly once exposed. A prior connection, a personal history that overlapped with the killer's past. Someone had recognized the patterns early and chosen silence over scrutiny, not out of loyalty, but fear. Fear of consequences, fear of being wrong, fear of being seen. Roe felt the betrayal settle heavily. This wasn't just a procedural failure, it was emotional. Trust had been weaponized, not by the Zodiac directly, but by his influence. He had created an environment where withholding felt safer than honesty. Control extended even here. "Did he ask you to?" Roe asked quietly. The answer came after a pause. He didn't have to. That was the worst part. The Zodiac didn't need to issue commands. He shaped behavior through implication alone, through the careful suggestion that chaos would follow truth, that revealing too much would cost more than silence ever could. As the fallout spread, earlier events reframed themselves with cruel clarity. Missed opportunities, delayed warrants, a letter dismissed as irrelevant. All of it traced back to one decision to protect oneself instead of the truth. The constellation Roe thought he was mapping had been subtly altered. Stars shifted just enough to mislead. Another letter arrived that evening. It wasn't addressed to Roe. It was addressed to all of you. Inside was a simple message, written with unnerving calm. "Even light bends when it's afraid." Roe understood then that fear was no longer the Zodiac's byproduct. It was his tool. He controlled not just outcomes, but emotions. Guilt, shame, loyalty. He didn't need to hide among strangers. He thrived among people who wanted to believe they were doing the right thing. Mara spoke quietly as they reviewed the damage. "This is what power looks like when it doesn't shout. It convinces." The city reacted the next day. Rumors of internal compromise leaked, twisting into accusations and conspiracy. Public trust eroded further. The killer's shadow stretched wider, darker, not because of what he did, but because of what others had allowed. Roe stood beneath the night sky later, staring upward. Constellations had always been stories people imposed on chaos, connecting distant points to make meaning. The Zodiac understood that better than anyone. He had turned people into stars and fear into gravity. But betrayal had consequences. Someone had broken, and once a secret surfaced, others followed. The silence was cracking, and with it came danger. The killer would feel the shift. He would react. Control, once threatened, demanded response. Roe knew what coming next. The Zodiac would not retreat. He would tighten his grip, pull closer, force a reckoning that no manipulation could soften. The pattern was collapsing inward now, toward exposure. And when it reached its center, fear would no longer be enough to hold it together.
The city held its breath. Streets that once seemed alive with whispers of fear now echoed only the distant hum of traffic. For the first time in weeks, there were no letters, no symbols carved into stone or concrete, no taunting notes left on desks. Silence, a silence so thick it pressed against the chest, heavy and accusing. Elias Rowe walked the empty corridors of headquarters, eyes lingering on bulletin boards that had once teemed with maps, photos, and theories. Now the boards were cluttered with gaps, holes where evidence had failed to materialize, where leads went cold. The Zodiac, for reasons unknown, had disappeared from the city's streets and minds alike. But absence was a different kind of presence. It clawed at him. Roe's dreams were restless, filled with patterns half-formed, symbols melting into shadows. He replayed every murder, every letter, every riddle. His hands shook when he reached for the files, compulsively scanning photos of crime scenes, as if missing a detail might summon answers that the silence refused to provide. Mara Quinn watched him, a quiet observer to a man unraveling. "He's still here," she said softly. "He doesn't need to leave marks anymore. He's in your thoughts, in your habits, in the gaps between your decisions." Roe nodded but could not speak. Withdrawal gnawed at him, a physical ache born from obsession. His life had become a series of anticipations, each heartbeat waiting for a symbol that never arrived. The pause wasn't mercy, it was strategy. The Zodiac had stepped back, but Roe felt the invisible leash tighten. Reports trickled in, tips that led nowhere, rumors that proved false, sightings that evaporated upon approach. The pattern was gone, but its weight remained. Roe questioned everything. Did justice demand answers, or was closure a myth invented by those unwilling to face uncertainty? Every methodical step forward felt futile, every routine inspection an exercise in futility. In the quiet of his office, he stared at the first letter, the one that had changed everything. The symbols that once screamed now seemed to whisper, haunting in their absence. Roe realized he had been tracking not just a killer, but the void left by that killer's choices, and the void, he discovered, was patient and relentless. Mara spoke again, her voice closer this time. Think about it. Silence forces you to confront the pattern inside your own mind. He's made you complicit in anticipation. Ro swallowed, the truth settling uneasily in his chest. The absence was deliberate. It wasn't retreat. It was control of a different kind. By stopping, the Zodiac had shifted the game inward, making the hunter chase shadows, doubt himself, and question what mattered most. Outside, the city continued, oblivious. People resumed their routines, unaware that the pause carried more terror than action ever had. The streets were safe, but safety had its own terror, a waiting that could never be ignored, a tension that throbbed quietly beneath ordinary life. Ro clenched the edges of his desk. He could feel the pattern coiling, waiting for the next move, for the moment the silence would break, and when it did, the confrontation would be sharper, more personal, and inevitable. He finally allowed himself a slow breath. The symbols were gone, the letters were gone, the killings had stopped, but the game had only entered a new invisible stage, and he understood with unsettling clarity that the Zodiac had never truly left. The silence was louder than any message could be, and it demanded attention, and attention, Ro knew, would have a price.
The night was colder than Ro expected. The city's hum, distant, filtered through the fog of adrenaline and anticipation. Every step toward the warehouse felt like stepping into a memory he hadn't lived yet, a place both unfamiliar and intimately known. Mara walked beside him, silent but alert, the tension between them thick enough to taste. They were no longer just hunters. They were participants in a reckoning long in the making. Inside, the Zodiac waited, not in shadow, not mythic, but human. Mid-40s, hands folded, eyes calm yet wary. There was no theatrics, no grand confession, just a man whose presence carried the weight of every calculation, every loss, every pattern ever enforced. Ro stepped forward. "It ends tonight," he said, voice steady, though every muscle in his body screamed. The man tilted his head. "End? No, detective," he replied, voice low, almost weary. "Endings are illusions. You've only begun to see me." Mara interjected. "We know who you are. We know the pattern. The lies, the control, the fear. It stops now." The Zodiac's eyes flicked between them. "You think you know me? Do you think understanding undoes anything? I am the sum of every rejection, every small betrayal, every time someone else decided for me what mattered." Ro's pulse quickened. The confrontation had arrived not with weapons, but with truth. Every letter, every symbol, every manipulation made sense now. The killer's power had never been in murder. It had been in shaping perception, bending others to see the world through his fractured lens. "You're broken," Ro said. "You've hurt people because you couldn't handle being hurt yourself." The Zodiac leaned back, almost relieved. "Perhaps, or perhaps I simply acknowledged reality. Control is the only way to survive when the world keeps choosing to fail you. You think me monstrous, but you cannot see how easily the line moves when you are always on the edge of abandonment." Mara's hand rested briefly on Ro's arm. "And yet," she said softly, "being broken is not permission to destroy." A flicker of shame crossed the Zodiac's features, quickly replaced by the habitual calm. "No permission is ever needed for consequences," he said. "You all wanted the truth. Here it is. But truths carry cost. Every revelation demands payment." Ro felt the moral weight settle on him, heavier than any physical threat. Justice had arrived, but it did not feel clean. The killer was caught. The letters ceased. The symbols could no longer haunt the streets, but the emotional ledger had debts that could never be repaid. Families would grieve, careers would falter, trust would remain fractured, and all it had been earned through years of manipulation, pain, and the quiet accumulation of fear. "You think stopping me fixes anything?" the Zodiac continued, voice sharper now. "You think removing me erases the patterns I forced into people's minds? You don't understand. Some wounds aren't healed by endings. They are marked by recognition." Ro exhaled slowly, realizing the terrible truth. Justice was never about balance. It was about bearing witness, and witnessing required survival, endurance, and sacrifice. "You wanted answers," Mara said, voice steady. "But the cost," she paused, letting the words sink. "The cost is not mine to dictate." The Zodiac smiled faintly, almost tenderly. "Exactly. The cost is universal. It's the price of knowing. And knowing," he added, "changes everything." As the officers moved in, the man allowed himself to be handcuffed without struggle.
There was no scream, no fight, no theatrics. Only the quiet weight of acknowledgement, of a life defined by patterns, of a mind forged in trauma, and of a world forever altered by the consequences of seeing too clearly. Rose stepped back, chest tight, staring at the man who had haunted the city, the investigation, and his own thoughts. He understood now that the Zodiac had never been a myth. He had been real, painfully real, and justice, while achieved, had extracted its due, leaving silence, reflection, and the sobering reminder that the price of understanding is rarely bearable.
The city woke differently that morning. Headlines screamed of resolution, the capture of the Zodiac presented as victory, closure neatly packaged for public consumption. Yet inside the walls of police headquarters, the air was heavy with exhaustion, disbelief, and something closer to mourning. Nothing about the case had been neat. Nothing had ever been simple. Elias Rowe walked slowly through the now quiet corridors, past empty desks and dimmed monitors. Colleagues he had once trusted looked at him with subtle suspicion, their own reflections of the fractures left by months of manipulation. Careers had been derailed by mistakes, misjudgments, and lapses of faith. Those who had withheld truths, even for fear or self-preservation, carried the weight of guilt like chains around their shoulders. Mara Quinn sat alone in the conference room, the shadows of the early morning stretching long across the floor. "Everyone thinks it ended when he was caught," she said without looking up, "but it didn't. Not really." Rowe nodded, staring at the files spread before them. Photographs, letters, maps, diagrams, evidence meticulously collected, evidence that had taken months to understand. And yet, even with the Zodiac behind bars, the patterns still lingered. Every image, every symbol, every calculated act had left a mark. Not on the city, perhaps, but on the people who had lived inside the investigation, inside the fear, inside the obsession. Outside, families walked past unaware of the scars left on those sworn to protect them. The public had closure. Rowe and his team had reflection. They had knowledge, and knowledge, he realized, was not balm, it was weight. The Zodiac had died as a free agent, perhaps even content in his final exposure, but the lives he had touched were left fractured, relationships strained to the point of breaking, friendships quietly dissolved, and marriages questioned what trust could ever endure. Rowe found himself walking past the sites where the symbols had first appeared, the parks and alleys now washed clean of their reminders. He could almost feel the absence pressing, a lingering presence that no arrest could erase. Every calculated letter, every taunt, every secret unveiled, had forced him to confront not just the killer's mind, but his own. Understanding evil, he realized, did not purify it. It refracted it, showing facets of human vulnerability, obsession, and fragility he had not anticipated. Mara joined him outside, gazing at the pale morning sky. "We caught him," she said softly, "but that doesn't mean we're safe from what he left behind. The world carries his patterns now, in every instinct we have, in every fear we remember." Rowe exhaled slowly, the city's hum washing over him, indifferent yet unrelenting. He thought of Lena, of colleagues who had faltered, of witnesses who had been manipulated, of himself. The Zodiac had left ashes behind, and in those ashes were questions that would never fully be answered. How much had he shaped them without their knowledge? How much of themselves had they lost trying to understand him? The past months had been a lesson in patience, observation, and endurance, but also in humility. Evil, he realized, could be understood but never fully contained. It could be confronted, analyzed, even neutralized physically, but its shadow, its ripple across lives, remained. The Zodiac might be behind bars, but the consequences of his existence, of the control he wielded, would linger indefinitely. Rowe turned back toward headquarters, leaving the streets behind. The city would continue. People will forget the tarot, the symbols, the letters, the fear. But for those who had been drawn into the constellation of obsession, the scars would never disappear. Understanding had come at a price, one that could not be returned. The Zodiac was gone, his voice silent. But in the quiet that followed, the shadows whispered that the pattern was never truly gone. It had only changed shape, and they would live with it for the rest of their days.